The launch dashboard behind us looked like a battlefield. Red error codes were flashing across every single screen in the room, one after another, faster than anyone could read them. Servers were crashing in real time, dropping like soldiers in a line. Customers were being locked out of the platform by the thousands, and the support ticket counter was climbing so fast the numbers looked like a slot machine that had lost its mind completely. The entire company had packed into the main conference room to witness what was supposed to be our greatest achievement. Instead, we were all watching it become our most public and expensive disaster. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The air felt thick and pressurized, like the ceiling was quietly descending on all of us. People stood frozen at the walls, staring at the screens with open mouths. Then Victor Hale, my director, pushed back his chair from the table with a sharp scraping sound that cut through the tension. He stood up straight. He adjusted his jacket with 2 deliberate tugs and then cleared his throat loud enough for the entire room to hear. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of controlled authority that only comes from rehearsal. "Everyone deserves to know the truth," he announced clearly. "Adrian Cole pushed this launch even after I warned him it was not ready." 40 people turned and looked directly at me all at once. My throat tightened instantly. I opened my mouth. The CEO raised one hand and the room went absolutely silent. Then Calvin Rourke, our lead investor, leaned forward and asked quietly, "Who made the final decision to launch?" Victor answered without hesitating for even a single second. "Adrian did." Whispers spread through the room like smoke. But deep inside my chest, something cold and solid settled in. Because Victor knew that was a lie. And he had just told it in front of everyone who mattered. Nobody defended me. Not a single person in that room spoke a word on my behalf. Not the engineers who had spent the previous 3 weeks warning Victor repeatedly that the platform was not ready. Not the team leads who had sat in the same meetings I had sat in and heard the same conversations. They all looked down at the conference table and studied the surface like it contained the most important information they had ever encountered. Victor continued in a calm, sorrowful tone, explaining carefully to the room how he had placed his full trust in me as product manager, how he had handed me ownership of the delivery timeline, and how my poor and reckless judgment had now obliterated months of careful work and millions of dollars in anticipated revenue. He delivered this account with the practiced sadness of a disappointed mentor, a leader let down by someone he had genuinely believed in. He made it sound almost tragic. The CEO's face shifted into something heavy and troubled. Investors exchanged quiet sideways glances that communicated everything without a single spoken word passing between them. I could feel my entire career tilting forward dangerously, like a tall structure balanced on a crumbling edge. Victor sat back down when he finished speaking. He placed both hands flat and still on the table in front of him. And then, for just one brief moment when he thought nobody was paying close attention, a small, satisfied expression crossed his face. He genuinely believed he had saved himself completely. He thought the story was closed. What Victor could not have known was that 3 weeks ago, when he made that launch decision in the upstairs meeting room, my laptop had been sitting open on the table the entire time. And it had been quietly recording every single word spoken in that room. When the meeting broke up, the hallways felt like a completely different building. The people I had worked beside every single day for 2.5 years could suddenly not seem to locate my eyes anywhere in a corridor. Coworkers who used to stop by my desk regularly to ask for my input on features, timelines, and strategy now walked past me the way people walk past old furniture on a pavement, with no recognition and no acknowledgement whatsoever. I walked back to my desk slowly, sat down, and stared at my monitor without seeing it. Then my phone buzzed with a notification. Victor had already sent an internal email to the board of directors. He had written it fast. The subject line read, "Launch Failure Analysis." I opened it and began reading carefully. The second full paragraph stated in clean, professional language, product manager Adrian Cole insisted on launching despite clear leadership concerns. Despite repeated guidance from senior management advising caution, Cole proceeded with the established timeline against the direct recommendations of his director. I read the message once. Then I read it a second time. Then a third, more slowly. My hands were trembling noticeably by the time I finished reading the final line. Victor had moved with extraordinary speed. While the rest of us were still processing what had just happened in that conference room, he had already been composing this email on his phone, constructing the official narrative before the last error code had even finished flashing on the screens behind us. He was not simply blaming me for the failure. He was doing something far more calculated and dangerous than that. He was rewriting the entire history of what had happened. He was changing documented facts. He was deliberately building a paper trail designed to make his invented version of events appear official, verified, and permanently recorded. That night I lay completely still in my dark bedroom staring at the ceiling for what felt like most of the night. Every time I tried to close my eyes, I was pulled straight back into the meeting room from 3 weeks earlier. The meeting where the actual decision had been made. The meeting where the real story had started. The engineering team had walked in looking visibly tense and uncomfortable. I remember Lena Voss setting her laptop down on the table with the kind of deliberate care that people use when they are preparing to say something difficult. Her jaw was tight. Her notes were organized in red. She had spent 3 full days running back-to-back stress tests on the platform infrastructure, and every single test had failed badly under the traffic load we were projecting for launch day. She laid out the findings clearly and without drama. The servers could not handle the volume. We needed a minimum of 2 additional weeks to resolve the infrastructure problems before a public release could even begin to approach safe territory. I backed her up without hesitation. I told Victor directly, with the entire team present, that we needed to delay the launch. That the risk was genuinely too high to ignore. That releasing the platform in its current state would almost certainly produce a catastrophic failure on the worst possible day, in front of the worst possible audience, with the worst possible consequences for everyone involved. Victor listened to all of it with his hands folded calmly. Then he leaned slightly forward and spoke quietly, with the measured ease of someone who had already made up their mind long before the meeting started. If we delay, he said, the investors will panic. We launch on Friday. When I pushed back directly a second time, he gave me a slow and careful smile. The kind of smile that carries no warmth in it anywhere. If something goes wrong, he said softly, we'll handle it. I had not fully grasped what he meant by those words at the time. Lying in the dark that night, I finally and completely understood. The following morning I was sitting at my kitchen table with a coffee that had gone cold while I stared at the same section of wall for the better part of 20 minutes. I had been trying to work out what to do next, but my mind kept circling without landing on anything solid. Then my phone vibrated twice in quick succession on the table beside me. I almost did not reach for it. But something made me pick it up. The 2 messages were from Calvin Rourke. The same investor who had asked that question at the end of yesterday's meeting. I had never received a direct personal message from Calvin before in my life. My name appearing in his contact list at all was already something I had not expected. His first message was short and completely direct. Adrian, something about yesterday felt wrong to me. I set the phone carefully back on the table. Then I picked it straight back up. His second message was already sitting below the first, waiting patiently. Did you really make the final decision? For precise words that I had been aching for someone in that company to ask me since the moment Victor stood up and opened his mouth. For words that confirmed that at least one person in the room had watched Victor deliver his perfectly prepared answer and chose to ask a follow-up question rather than simply accept it. I sat with the sunlight coming slowly through the kitchen window and just breathed for a moment. Then I typed back asking if we could meet somewhere in person, away from the office. Calvin responded in under 2 minutes. Yes. Tell me when and where. We met at a small cafe about 15 minutes from the office building, far enough away that the chance of running into anyone from the company was genuinely low. Calvin was already seated when I arrived, his jacket folded precisely over the back of the empty chair beside him, a plain black coffee on the table in front of him, untouched. He looked exactly the same as he always did in boardrooms and investor meetings. Calm, completely focused, and entirely impossible to read with any confidence. He did not offer small talk or pleasantries. He simply looked at the chair across the table and waited for me to sit down in it. I took a slow breath and began talking. I went through the timeline carefully and in full order. I explained what had happened in the engineering meeting 3 weeks before the launch date. I explained exactly what Victor had said that day. I explained how I had pushed back and been overruled clearly and completely. I explained the email he had sent to the board the same afternoon the launch fell apart. I watched Calvin's face the entire time I spoke. His expression did not change much on the surface, but his eyes were sharp and constantly moving, the way a person's eyes move when they are actively sorting and organizing information rather than just passively receiving it. When I finally finished, he was quiet for a measured moment. Then he asked me something I had not anticipated at all. "Do you have proof?" My heart knocked hard against my ribs. I had asked myself that exact question through most of the night. I reached into my bag, pulled out my laptop, and placed it on the table between us. I opened the video file on my laptop and pressed play without any introduction. The recording was clean and clear. The meeting room had good natural acoustics, and my laptop microphone had captured every voice at the table without any static or distortion at all. Victor's voice came through the small cafe speakers carrying the same relaxed, unquestioned authority it always projected when he was in a room he believed he controlled completely. "We launch Friday." End of discussion. Then the engineers pushed back again, carefully and professionally, laying out the risk factors one more time with patient precision. My own voice appeared in the recording too, measured and direct, recommending the 2-week delay and explaining in clear terms exactly why it was necessary for the safety of the platform. Victor cut across me while I was still mid-sentence. "I'm the director. The decision is mine." The recording continued playing for several more minutes. Victor closed the meeting. People filed out with the quiet resignation of people who had said what needed to be said and been ignored. When I stopped the video, the cafe around us felt very still and small. Calvin leaned back in his chair slowly and looked at the ceiling for a brief moment. Then he brought his eyes back down to me. "You let him blame you in front of the entire company," he said. Not quite a question. More like a statement he was examining carefully from multiple angles. I met his gaze steadily. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I needed him to finish building the lie completely before I could show people what the truth actually looked like." Calvin studied me without expression for a long and quiet moment. Then he gave one single, deliberate nod. "Good," he said. Just that one word. Nothing else. But the weight he placed on it told me clearly that something important had shifted between us. The next morning began with a phone call from the HR department at 8:45 on the dot. The woman on the line was professionally polite but noticeably stiff, speaking with the carefully measured tone of someone reading from a script they did not personally write. She asked me to come in for a meeting at 9 o'clock regarding my current employment status. I already knew before I walked through the door what I was going to find on the other side of it. Victor had filed formal termination paperwork. The HR manager, a quiet and visibly uncomfortable man named Paul, confirmed it without lifting his eyes from the documents in front of him. The official language cited gross negligence in product management responsibilities resulting in significant operational and financial damage to the organization. Victor had not waited for any investigation to begin. He had not waited for the board review that Calvin was already quietly initiating behind the scenes. He had moved the very moment he sensed that the pressure in the room was beginning to shift direction. He understood, probably better than most people in that building, that truth becomes much harder for people to uncover once the primary witness has already been formally removed from the premises and stripped of their access and credibility simultaneously. I sat in the HR office and listened to everything Paul said without interrupting. Then I asked him to document the exact timeline of Victor's paperwork submission. I asked him to note specifically what time it had been filed in relation to the board meeting. He gave me a slightly uncertain look, then reached for his pen and slowly wrote it down exactly as I had requested. I thanked him, stood up, and walked out. Lena Voss was standing in the hallway directly outside the HR department when I came through the door. She had her arms crossed and her back against the wall, and the expression on her face made it completely clear that she already knew exactly what had taken place in the room behind me. Lena was not the kind of engineer who spent words carelessly. She had been with the company for 6 solid years, longer than most of the people currently sitting in leadership positions, and she had built a quiet but firm reputation for saying uncomfortable things in meetings that almost always turned out to be precisely correct about 6 months later. She looked at me for a brief second, then pushed off the wall and fell into step beside me, matching my pace without any discussion about direction. Her voice was low and very controlled. "He is lying about you." "I know," I said. "What I need now is for other people to know it too." Without breaking her stride, she reached into the folder she was carrying tucked under her arm and held it out toward me. I took it carefully. "Victor told us to delete this report," she said quietly. "I made a copy of the full document before I did anything with the original." I opened the folder while we walked together down the corridor. Inside was the complete engineering risk analysis report. The one Lena's team had worked on and finalized 2 weeks before the launch date. The one that laid out in precise and detailed technical language exactly why the platform was structurally not ready for a live release under real traffic conditions. 18 pages of data, test results, failure projections, infrastructure assessments, and clearly stated recommendations. Every single page carried a date stamp. Not one of them was dated after my supposed decision to push the launch forward. I stopped walking. I looked at Lena directly. "Thank you," I said, and meant it completely. She shrugged like it cost her nothing at all. "He should not have done this to you," she said simply. I sat in my car on the second level of the parking garage and read through the full report from the beginning without rushing. Lena's team had been thorough to a degree that went well beyond what was strictly required of them. The document was precise and technically unambiguous in every section. It identified 6 distinct failure risks embedded in the server infrastructure. It projected with high statistical confidence that the platform would not remain stable under real launch day traffic volume. It recommended a delay of no fewer than 2 full weeks and provided a detailed and specific list of the exact fixes that needed to be implemented and tested before any public release could responsibly move forward. At the top of the document was a clear notation that the report had been formally submitted to Victor Hale 10 days before the scheduled launch date. That detail was not buried or hidden. It was right at the top where anyone reading would see it immediately. Below the final page of technical analysis, printed on a separate sheet, was Victor's written response to the entire document. 1 sentence. Just one. "Proceed with launch as scheduled." His signature sat cleanly beneath it. Victor Hale, Director of Product Development. I stared at that single sentence for a very long time without moving. It was the cleanest and most complete piece of evidence I had ever held in my hands. It required no explanation and no additional context from anyone. It did not need a recording to give it meaning. It simply said, in his own handwriting with his own name attached, that he had received every available warning the engineering team could give him, considered it all, and chose to ignore every word of it. He had not been misled by me. He had not been surprised by the outcome. He had been warned formally and in writing, had signed his name to the decision anyway, and then stood up in front of 40 people and pointed at me. 2 days after the HR meeting, the board of directors called a formal emergency review. The room they reserved for it was significantly larger than the standard conference room, with a long oval table and chairs arranged in a careful formation on both sides. Board members filled one side. Calvin was positioned near the center. Victor arrived looking polished and professionally composed, his posture relaxed and unhurried, exactly like a man who had spent the previous 48 hours rehearsing carefully and now felt fully prepared for his performance. He greeted people at the door with a quiet and appropriately serious nod. I sat near the far end of the table with the folder from Lena and my laptop bag on the floor beside my chair. I did not greet anyone. I simply waited and let the room settle around me. The chairperson opened the session by explaining its purpose briefly. She then invited Victor to present his full account of the events leading up to the launch. Victor spoke for exactly 12 minutes. His version of the story was fluid, detailed, logically structured, and completely inverted from reality. He described how he had raised legitimate concerns about the timeline in multiple settings but had ultimately and respectfully deferred to my judgment as the product manager formally responsible for delivery. He framed his behavior as trust, as appropriate delegation, as giving a capable team member the ownership and space they needed to do their job. He sounded entirely reasonable and genuinely saddened by the outcome. Then Calvin raised his hand with quiet and familiar calmness, the same way he had raised it in the original meeting when the error codes were still cascading down the screens. The room settled. Before we continue, Calvin said evenly, I would like to watch the meeting recording from 3 weeks ago. Victor's smile did not disappear all at once. It faded slowly and unevenly, like a fire running low on fuel. The boardroom's audio and visual system was considerably larger and more powerful than my laptop screen by a wide margin. When Victor's voice came through the room's built-in speakers, it carried the same relaxed authority it always did in person, the voice of someone accustomed to being the final word on every subject in any room he occupied. The entire board watched in complete silence from the moment the recording started. Nobody shifted in their seats. Nobody whispered to the person beside them. Nobody looked at their phone or their notes. When Victor's recorded voice said, I'm the director. The decision is mine, one of the board members slowly and deliberately set down the pen she had been holding, placing it on the table with a small and precise movement that somehow carried enormous weight in the silence. When my own voice appeared in the recording recommending the delay and explaining the specific reasons behind it, I did not look at Victor. I kept my eyes on the table directly in front of me. The recording continued for 3 more minutes and 40 additional seconds after that exchange. Then the screen went dark and the room went quiet in a way that felt fundamentally different from ordinary silence. This was the kind of quiet that settles over a space when she had been with the company since its earliest years and had developed a well-earned reputation for asking precisely the questions that everyone else in the room was quietly hoping someone else would be brave enough to raise first. She turned toward Victor with a movement that was slow and entirely deliberate. Her voice, when she spoke, was perfectly level and completely controlled, the kind of even tone that is considerably harder to argue against than outright anger because it carries no emotion to deflect or dismiss. You blamed him for your decision? She did not raise her voice even slightly. She did not need to. Victor's carefully maintained exterior began cracking at the edges almost immediately. He leaned forward and started speaking quickly, explaining that the recording was missing important context, that his words that day had been significantly mischaracterized, that the full and accurate story was more nuanced and complex than a single recorded meeting could possibly convey to people who had not been living inside the project for months. He used words like collaborative and shared ownership and evolving process and mutual understanding. He strung them together in smooth combinations that sounded almost reasonable if you did not look too carefully at what they actually meant. The more he spoke, the quieter the room became around him. Not because anyone was agreeing with the explanation he was building, but because everyone in that room could see clearly, in real time, that they were watching a man attempt to construct a new structure directly on top of a foundation that had already collapsed completely and irreversibly beneath him. Patricia waited until he stopped talking entirely. Then she said, in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever, "We watched you say it." She did not add anything further. She did not need to. Bernard Walsh, the company's CFO, had remained noticeably quiet through most of the meeting proceedings. He wore reading glasses on a woven cord around his neck and had a distinctive habit of recording his notes in extremely small and precise handwriting along the margins of printed documents. He cleared his throat and asked the chairperson if he could share something he believed was directly relevant to the review. She nodded her permission. Bernard opened a printed document on the table in front of him and read from it in a plain and factual voice without any editorial commentary attached to the numbers or the timeline. 3 weeks before the launch, Victor Hale had sent a formal written commitment to 3 of the company's major investors. The commitment explicitly promised that the product would launch before the close of the current financial quarter. If the launch did not occur within that window, a performance-based bonus structure tied specifically to the quarterly milestone would not be triggered or paid out. Bernard paused and then read the specific bonus figure aloud without inflection. $240,000. The atmosphere in the room shifted noticeably when he said it. Not dramatically or suddenly, but in the subtle and fundamental way that a room changes when a missing piece of critical information finally arrives and everything you already thought you understood about a situation quietly repositions itself inside your mind into a shape that makes far more sense than the shape it held before that moment. Victor had not forced the launch because he believed in the product's readiness. He had not forced it because he trusted my judgment or anyone else's. He had forced it because he personally needed that financial quarter to close on time. And when the platform failed in the most visible way possible, he needed another person to absorb every consequence of that choice before anyone thought to look at his calendar and his bank account side by side. I opened my laptop and pulled up the email chain I had printed and carefully saved during the 2 weeks leading up to the launch. I had kept it at the time simply out of habit, the routine documentation practice of a product manager who understood the importance of maintaining clear records of where a project stood at every stage. I had not known when I saved those emails that I would one day need them the way I needed them in this room. I passed printed copies down both sides of the table simultaneously. The emails were direct exchanges between Victor and 2 of the investors currently present in the boardroom. They were specific, confident, and unambiguous. Victor had assured both investors in writing that the launch would proceed on the announced date without qualification, regardless of any internal technical assessments currently underway within the team. He had used the phrase "fully confident in delivery" in the body of the second email. The third email in the chain, sent just 4 days before the launch date, had been written the same afternoon that Lena's engineering team had submitted their complete risk report to Victor for his review and formal response. Victor had read that report. The contents were confirmed in the read receipt. His response to the investors that same afternoon contained no mention of the engineering warnings. No reference to the infrastructure concerns. No acknowledgement of the risk assessment that his own team had just formally submitted. He told them the platform was on track and ready. I set Lena's folder on the table beside my open laptop. I did not say anything additional. I simply allowed the 2 sets of documents to sit beside each other in plain view and let the people in the room read both at their own pace and reach their own conclusions without any assistance or direction from me. The room went very quiet. It was a different quality of quiet than any that had come before it during the meeting. This was not the quiet of people still forming a question. This was the quiet of people who had already arrived at the answer. Victor had been watching me lay out each piece of evidence with an expression that moved through several distinct phases as the morning progressed. He had walked in with careful composure, the practiced stillness of someone who had convinced themselves thoroughly that they were prepared for everything. Then came smaller movements around the edges of his face, a tightening near his eyes, a slight tension at his jaw, a barely perceptible flare at the corners of his nostrils. Then, when the investor emails appeared on the table directly beside the engineering report, something colder and more exposed came through his expression. He looked at me directly for the first time since the review had begun. His voice had lost the measured and considered quality it had carried through his earlier presentation. "You are destroying the company," he said. "You are taking isolated moments completely out of context and turning them into weapons. This is not about what is genuinely best for the product, the team, or the investors around this table. This is personal, Adrian, and you know exactly what you are doing." Every eye in the room moved to me. I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward or change my posture or show him that his words had come anywhere close to the places he was trying to reach with them. I looked back at him with the same steadiness I had been maintaining all morning. "No," I said clearly. "You tried to destroy me. I am showing people what actually happened." He opened his mouth again. I did not wait for him. "Every document I have placed before this board was created before the launch date. I did not write or compile a single item after the fact. You were warned formally and in writing. You chose to proceed. You made promises to investors that the engineering team had already told you were unsafe to make. You signed your name to a termination request for the person who tried to stop you from making those promises. That is the complete story." The engineers sitting along the side of the room had been shifting quietly in their chairs for the better part of the previous 15 minutes. When Lena stood up from her seat, I do not think anyone in the room was entirely surprised by the movement. But the effect it produced was still powerful and immediate in the way that a dam finally releasing water is powerful, perhaps anticipated on some level, but still enormous and impossible to contain when it actually happens. She stood with her folder in front of her and stated clearly that every document and piece of evidence I had presented to the board matched the internal record that the engineering team had been maintaining throughout the entire project lifecycle. She stated that Victor had given her a direct personal instruction to delete the risk analysis report after the launch failed. She stated that she had refused that instruction and had instead made and preserved a full copy of the document before the original was touched. Then one of the other engineers along the wall stood up. He did not make a speech or offer a long explanation. He simply said that he had been present in the meeting 3 weeks ago, that he had heard Victor's exact words with complete clarity, and that he had said nothing publicly in the days following the failure because he had been genuinely afraid of what speaking up might cost him professionally. But he was saying it now, in this room, with the board present. Then another engineer stood. Then another one after that. Not all at once or with any theatrical coordination. One at a time, spaced apart, each standing and speaking briefly and clearly. Victor sat at the center of the table, physically surrounded on both sides by the people whose careful warnings he had dismissed without consideration, whose work he had placed at risk for a personal financial incentive, and whose extended silence he had relied upon as a structural part of his plan. That silence was now finished. He said nothing. He looked at the table. For the first time in the entire period I had worked under him, Victor Hale had absolutely nothing to say to a room full of people. Calvin Rourke had not spoken for a considerable stretch of the meeting. He had been observing the room with the same quality of attention he had given me in the cafe, sorting everything carefully, measuring each piece against the others, building a complete picture from the components as they arrived. When Lena and the engineers finally sat back down and the room settled into stillness, Calvin uncapped his pen and set it deliberately on the table in front of him. He looked toward the center of the oval table without directing his gaze at any specific individual. His voice was entirely unhurried and perfectly calm when he spoke. He asked the same question he had asked at the very beginning of everything, in the middle of the chaos and the flashing red error codes and the collapsing servers, when Victor had stood up and delivered his practiced answer without even a moment of hesitation. Who made the final decision to launch? He did not look at me when he asked. He did not look at Victor. He directed the question at the empty center of the table, at the space where an honest answer should have been sitting from the very first moment anyone thought to ask. The room did not answer right away. Not because nobody knew what the correct answer was, but because the answer had now been established so thoroughly and from so many independent directions simultaneously, that speaking it aloud felt almost like unnecessary repetition. It had already been spoken by the recording. It had been spoken by the single sentence at the bottom of the engineering report, sitting below 18 pages of ignored warnings with Victor's signature underneath it. It had been spoken by 6 engineers standing up one after another. The silence itself carried the answer. And everyone in that room, including the man who had worked so hard to bury it, understood it completely. The chairperson asked Victor to wait outside the boardroom while the members conducted their deliberation. He stood up from his chair with a slow and controlled movement. For a moment he looked like he was preparing to say something to the room, his mouth opened slightly, but no words appeared. He picked up his leather portfolio from the table, placed it firmly under his arm, and walked toward the door with the stiff and deliberate posture of someone working extremely hard to project an appearance of composure they no longer actually possessed. The door closed behind him with a quiet and final sound. I was also asked to wait in the hallway during deliberations, in a designated area at the far end of the corridor from where Victor had been directed to sit. I lowered myself onto a bench near the water cooler and fixed my eyes on the floor tiles without any particular intention. I was not spending the waiting time strategizing or calculating. I was thinking about the version of events that Victor had almost managed to make permanent. I was thinking about how carefully and completely it had nearly worked. Without the recording, the outcome of everything would have been entirely different. Without Lena making the decision to keep a copy of the report rather than delete it as instructed, the paper trail that proved Victor's direct responsibility would have simply ceased to exist. Without Calvin choosing to feel that something was wrong rather than accepting the first answer, no second question would ever have been asked. Each of those things had happened. But each of them had come extraordinarily close to not happening. I sat with that reality on the bench and let it settle into me without looking away from it. The deliberation lasted 41 minutes. I know the precise duration because I found myself watching the clock mounted on the wall directly across from my bench without consciously deciding to do so. When the boardroom door opened and Patricia Osei stepped into the corridor and asked me to come back in, her expression told me nothing specific and everything important at exactly the same moment. Victor was brought back into the room through a separate entrance. He entered ahead of me and stood near his chair without sitting down in it. The chairperson spoke briefly, without any elaborate language or extended preamble. The board had reviewed the totality of the evidence, the recorded documentation, the engineering report, the investor emails, and the direct testimony of 6 members of the technical team. The review had been thorough and the vote had been unanimous. Victor Hale was removed from his position as Director of Product Development effective immediately. He was placed on formal administrative leave pending a full HR investigation into his instruction to delete the engineering report and his communications with investors regarding launch readiness. A security officer would accompany him to collect his personal belongings from his office. Victor did not respond. His face did not collapse in any dramatic way. He simply stood completely still for one extended moment, like a person who has just stepped off a ledge and has not yet fully registered that the ground they expected to land on is not there beneath them at all. Then he gave one very small nod, turned without a word, and walked toward the exit door. I was collecting my documents from the table and placing them back into the folder when Victor passed behind my chair on his way out of the room. The security officer followed at a respectful and professional distance, close enough to be present and clear enough not to be unnecessary. Victor slowed his pace as he reached the space behind my chair. I did not turn around to face him. But I heard his footsteps stop entirely. He spoke in a voice that was low and tightly controlled, carrying something that was working hard to present itself as anger but had far too much exhaustion running underneath it to succeed at the performance. "You ruined my life," he said. I kept my hands on the documents on the table for a moment without moving them. Then I straightened up to my full height and turned to face him. He looked considerably older than he had when he walked into the room that morning. His jaw was set with effort, but his eyes were the eyes of someone who had just watched every card he was holding fall out of his hands and scatter across the floor. I held his gaze without looking away from it. I did not feel triumphant standing there. I did not feel the sharp satisfaction I might have expected in quieter moments during the previous week. I felt tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could easily reach, and I felt something that surprised me in its closeness to pity. "You tried to ruin mine first," I said. My voice was quiet. "Not for the room. Just for the two of us, and just for the plain truth of it. He held my eyes for one more second. Then he turned and walked out with the security officer behind him. The door closed. The room breathed. Calvin called that evening just after 7 o'clock. I was sitting in my kitchen in the same chair where I had read his first message 4 days earlier. The coffee beside me was warm this time. I answered on the second ring without letting myself think too much about what the call meant or where it was going. He spoke without any greeting or opening pleasantry, exactly the way he always communicated. "You stayed completely calm while he tried to bury you," Calvin said. "You had the recording from the very first day. You had the engineering report within 24 hours after that. You could have gone directly to the board, or to the press, or sent that recording to the entire company email list. You had multiple options available to you at every stage." "Yes," I said. "But I needed the complete picture to be visible before I showed it to anyone. Showing half the truth too early would have let him reframe the rest of it as spin or as desperation. The only way the evidence worked was if it all arrived together and could stand without my commentary." There was a pause on the line. "Do you know what the most genuinely expensive thing in any organization is?" Calvin asked. I understood he was going to answer his own question, so I waited and let him do it. "It is not the product," he said. "It is not the technology or the infrastructure or the market positioning. It is the quality of judgment demonstrated by people in the room when the pressure is at its absolute highest and the easiest thing available would be to do the wrong thing." He paused once more. "Most people in your exact position would have either gone completely silent or completely nuclear. You chose neither path." I did not have a response ready for that, so I said nothing and let it sit. "That is leadership," Calvin said simply. Then he told me to sleep and that there was more to discuss in the morning. The board reached out with a formal written offer 2 days later. They were asking me to lead the complete recovery team for the product relaunch. Not a temporary or consultative arrangement. A full appointment with expanded authority, a revised title reflecting the scope of the responsibility, and a compensation structure adjusted to match. The same product. The same platform that Victor had driven into a public failure in front of every investor and customer the company had. The same launch that had carried my name in the blame column while his name sat safely on the decision that caused it. They wanted me to fix it and bring it back. I held the offer for a full day before I responded to it. Not because I was uncertain about accepting. I had known from the moment I read the terms that I was going to say yes, because the work itself still genuinely mattered and the engineering team that had stood up in that boardroom deserved to work under someone who would actually listen to them. I took the day because I wanted to enter the role with complete clarity about what I was committing to. This was not a reward given to me for enduring something difficult. It was a serious responsibility with real weight attached to it. The product had failed in the first place because someone with formal authority over the process had consistently refused to listen to the people who understood the technical reality best. My most important function in this new role was to ensure that dynamic never existed again inside that team, not as a demonstration of my own values, but because the engineers who had trusted me enough to stand up and speak deserved an environment where their expertise was genuinely used and genuinely respected. I called back the following morning and accepted without qualification. The second launch was entirely different from the first one in every way that mattered. The timeline was set by the engineering team and only by the engineering team, not by an investor commitment document or a director's personal bonus threshold. Lena led the full infrastructure rebuild from the foundation level upward. Every stress test was run to completion before any public announcement was made or any date was communicated to anyone outside the building. When a test failed, we paused the timeline without discussion or negotiation. When a test uncovered a new problem that nobody had anticipated, we added it to the list and fixed it before moving forward. Nobody was asked to delete a report. Nobody was pressured to move faster than the system was genuinely ready to move. Nobody sat in a meeting and heard their careful technical assessment dismissed with a smooth sentence about investor confidence. It took 4 full months. There were difficult stretches and late nights and weeks where progress felt slower than standing completely still. But the team functioned differently throughout all of it. People spoke openly and early when something concerned them. Problems surfaced the moment they were identified rather than managed quietly in the background. There was a shared understanding in every meeting that raising a concern cost nothing and solved things faster. On the morning of the second launch, I stood in the same conference room where the first one had disintegrated around us. The dashboard was running cleanly. The servers were holding steadily under live traffic. The numbers climbed in smooth and healthy increments as users came onto the platform in real numbers. No cascading red error codes. No infrastructure collapse. No silent room full of people watching something they could not stop. It held completely. When the first full hour completed without a single critical failure, the team erupted. Lena looked across the room at me with an expression that balanced relief and earned satisfaction in equal measure. I nodded back at her. She had earned every second of that moment more than anyone else in the building. 3 months after the second launch, the company held its quarterly investor meeting in the same large conference room where the board review had taken place. The product had significantly outperformed its projections in the period since relaunch, recovering the customers lost in the original failure and adding a substantial number of new accounts beyond what the original targets had anticipated. The numbers told a clear and honest story, and I presented them without embellishment and without omission. I walked the room through the full recovery timeline, explained the decisions that had been made differently the second time and the reasons behind each one, and answered investor questions for approximately 40 minutes with the same directness I tried to bring to every room I was in. When the formal presentation concluded and people began collecting their things and preparing to leave, Calvin raised his hand one final time. The room resettled into attention. He looked comfortable and unhurried, the way he always looked in rooms where he was paying his closest attention to everything happening around him. He asked the same question he had asked twice before in 2 very different versions of the same room. The first time in the wreckage of a failing launch, when Victor had answered it instantly and without hesitation or truth. The second time in a boardroom surrounded by evidence and engineers and a recorded voice that had made every lie unnecessary to argue against. His voice was calm and entirely familiar. Who made the final decision? He let it rest in the air between all of them for a moment, the same way he had let it rest before. Then he looked slowly around the table at the board members, at the investors, at the team leads arranged along the wall behind me, and he answered it himself. He gestured toward me with one open and unhurried hand, a simple movement that carried more weight than any speech could have. This time, he said, with the quiet certainty of someone stating something that had always been true and was now simply visible to everyone in the room at once, the right person did.